Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to another Walking Dead video. So I wanted to talk about Andrew Lincoln and whether or not we could actually see him appear in like cameo scenes in The Walking Dead Daryl Dixon, The Walking Dead Dead City, and other shows that could happen in the future. Because obviously we're gonna have to wait a bit before we see him again, right? Like we don't know in what form we're gonna see him again. It does seem like it is gonna happen, but we just don't know if it's gonna be in a new series or if it's gonna be in a season 2 of The Ones Who Live, right? Like that's all very much in like the early stages. And I think that, in order to determine when we could see him again, a lot of the story in Dead City and Daryl Dixon sort of has to change a little bit here. Because if you look at where season 2 goes, or where it could go for The Ones Who Live or a new series, I do think you have to sort of, build up some of the story with the variant walkers, because it very much seems like this next part of the story is likely going to be the CRM versus Madame Genet, which that was something I always sort of talked about as well. I always kind of assumed that the CRM in some sense would be more like, I don't want to say heroes, but they would definitely be something that would eventually be on our side, right? And Madame Genet, what she's doing with variant walkers and all that, obviously very bad, right? So I kind of assumed at some point in the future that it would be more the CRM versus Madame Genet, but I didn't see what happened at The Ones Who Live happening. I never saw it happening like exactly like that. So definitely very different, but I think that storyline could still definitely happen for like the big Endgame series. And so that's why I wanted to talk about Andrew Lincoln and sort of, Rick Grimes and I guess what we could actually see from the character and, a possible cameo in Daryl Dixon season 2 or in like other shows. So obviously make sure to be a subscriber if you do want to get all my Walking Dead content like this. As of now, we're just awaiting the Daryl Dixon season 2 trailer. I'm not entirely sure when that's supposed to be coming out, but it does seem like it's going to be coming out very, very soon. I'm assuming that it's going to be out at some point in the next week. I mean, if it's not out today, there's a chance it could come out on the weekend, but I'm assuming it's going to be like on Monday or Tuesday, and it might be the official trailer. It might be a teaser trailer. There might be a release date. I'm not entirely sure what they're coming out with, but it seems like something is for sure happening. So if you want to get my breakdown of all of that, then yeah, definitely make sure to be a subscriber. But let's get into what I wanted to talk about here. So originally, I think a couple of weeks ago, or I don't know when it was, but I did a video talking about a bunch of other things. And I kind of talked about, could we ever see a Rick Grimes cameo scene with Carol? Now, I'm not going to focus on that specifically, but what I actually really wanted to talk about was more Andrew Lincoln and, the idea of him doing cameos and stuff. And, is it possible for him to actually show up at some point in any of these shows? And I do feel like the reason why he never showed up in any of the shows beforehand was because of the story, right? Like, it's one thing, because a part of it was like the reveal, right? The reveal of Rick Grimes, of seeing Rick Grimes for the first time again after so many years. That was something that was very like, people were really anticipating that moment. And it was such a massive moment just in general to first see Rick Grimes, in The Ones Who Live. And it was just amazing. It was honestly a really amazing experience. And I think that now, obviously seeing Rick Grimes, it's not as like exciting. I mean, obviously it's still exciting to see any of the characters. Like I would say it's still exciting to see, Daryl or like anyone else, right? So I think that at this point you probably could do more cameo scenes with Andrew Lincoln or I guess Rick Grimes. And because the story isn't so much of a mystery, because remember for years, it was a big mystery as to what happened to Rick, what's he going through at the CRM and all of that. There was such a huge just storyline there where we were all trying to figure out what was going on with Rick Grimes and like where the story was going to go and all that for so long. And now we're not in a place like that. Now we're in a place where I think he could actually show up in certain scenes if the scene obviously makes sense. Like it does have to make sense. And that's why I talked about that one scene with Carol, if that were to actually happen, I think it makes some sense because the big reveal here for season 2, and this is what's going to be very exciting about Daryl Dixon season 2, is Daryl finding out that Rick actually made it back, that he is alive, because he knows that he's alive, but he doesn't really know. I don't really like how they did the reveal at the end of The Walking Dead, because Judith kind of says, he could be out there, or, like, I wish she would have said it more like, my mom found some proof that he could be alive. I don't know, just went into some more detail with it. And then Daryl's reaction wasn't really, because there's a huge storyline happening at the same time. They're all sort of rushing through, that hospital or whatever they were in. So it just felt like that moment should have been bigger. And so I hope that in Daryl Dixon season 2, they actually fix that here. Like they actually have Daryl Dixon find out that Rick Grimes made it back home. He is with Judith and RJ, with Michonne, And, just knowing that all of them are alive and happy, I just wonder what that's going to be like for Daryl. And I like, honestly, the perfect character to tell him that is Carol. Like, Carol is the perfect character to tell Daryl that, Rick made it back. And, I'm just trying to think of what the chemistry is going to be like in the scene and what the scene would just be in general. It's going to be a very big scene. I think it would be really amazing because all the spinoffs have had cameo scenes, right? Or flashback scenes. It would be so cool if they did sort of a couple of months in the past, like flashback to Carol seeing Rick. And again, you don't have to have Michonne in the scene. I think it would be really amazing if you could, but say you couldn't get Rick and Michonne to actually be there in the scene. Like, even if you just got Andrew Lincoln, just to have a scene with Rick and Carol where Rick is like, oh, hey, this and that. And just kind of, they're talking about whatever. And maybe Carol mentions, yeah, Daryl's out there somewhere. I'm going to go try and find him or whatever. And then Rick's like, I don't know where the scene would go, but it's a very short scene. Again, it'd probably be a minute or two long. And then, that is set up to the fact that Carol knows that Rick made it back. Carol actually saw Rick. And then, that's just a part of Daryl Dixon. And then in that sense, we actually had Rick appear in Daryl Dixon season 2. A really amazing flashback scene, right? And it actually serves as a part of the story because that's a big part of Daryl's story originally is, that's why he went out there. He was looking for Rick, right? And so I think it makes sense. All of it makes sense. And so that's why I wanted to talk about this in general. Like, is that unreasonable to expect now with Andrew Lincoln coming back to play Rick Grimes? And I really do believe that it's not that unreasonable. I think beforehand, and I think that's why we never really talked about it a lot, right? Like, we never really talked about Andrew Lincoln showing up just randomly here and there or whatever. Maybe we talked about sort of a voiceover thing where he would appear on like a radio because that kind of made sense with, hyping up the story. But you were never going to see Rick Grimes until The Ones Who Live, right? Until we got that very first show or very first scene of him, right? Like, that was going to be the big reveal. But everything else was sort of, we didn't really talk about it too much. Besides the finale, I know there was some debate about that. Like will Andrew Lincoln actually show up in the very last episode of The Walking Dead? And obviously he did. That was very, very cool. Honestly, I kind of want to go back and like rewatch The Ones Who Live in some sense. There's a part of me that just like really wants to go back and like re-experience some of those moments, knowing what I know about where the story goes. But anyways, that's another video for another time. But like obviously there's a lot of talk about Andrew Lincoln, maybe appearing in Daryl Dixon season 2. But like, what about Dead City? Is that possible? I think in terms of Dead City, it is definitely very much possible, but it depends on the story. It really does. And I feel like if it were to happen, you would need it to make sense. Like, that's why I think it makes sense for him to show up in like Daryl Dixon, because, it actually plays a role in the story as to why Daryl's in France and Carol trying to find him and all of that. But for a flashback scene or for something like that to happen in Dead City, that's where it gets very tricky because like Maggie and Negan aren't really looking for him. It would be a random scene out of nowhere. You're not going to get Rick Grimes there in like the current story. Like, I don't know why you would have a scene like that unless, again, you would just have to come up with a really interesting storyline that makes sense, especially considering the fact that it would be a lot to have Andrew Lincoln come back as Rick Grimes, right? To do a scene like that. So I'm really, I'm interested in that. I also think it makes a lot more sense in terms of, for Daryl Dixon to have Andrew Lincoln appear in that show because, he's over there in the UK, right? And Daryl Dixon films in France, and I think they might be changing locations. There's a rumor anyways that they're changing locations for season 3, which is actually starting to film next month. And so, it's a lot easier, obviously, in terms of filming and stuff for that. So I think that, that could make a lot of sense. I think that for Dead City, also the timeline you have to really take into consideration with Dead City, right? That's like a couple of years after Rick made it back, or it's like 2 to 3 years after, I believe. A year or 2 to 3 years. It's somewhere in that range anyways. And so Maggie and Negan at this point, they must know that he's back. But, in order for them to actually talk about him or anything, like, it just has to make sense. And I don't know how they're going to address a lot of that. There's a lot of questions I do have there. But in terms of him showing up just in general in other cameos, in other spinoffs or whatever, I think that it's going to really depend on the story. It really is going to depend on the story. Again, it hasn't happened in a while because it really made no sense for it to happen. And like, I don't think Andrew Lincoln's against, showing up in cameos. Like, I don't think he's against anything like that, because I think he just wants the story to be really good. And obviously he loves playing Rick Grimes. Like, he loves playing that character. And, there was a lot of talk about certain things during The Ones Who Live, during the writing process of that show, in which, they talked about reuniting with characters like Daryl, Maggie, Negan, etc. So I think that, they do have plans on when those things are going to happen. Like, Rick Grimes, Andrew Lincoln literally was in Fear the Walking Dead, right? In that very first episode of season 4. So, like, it is possible. I could see these things happening. If they were to do another spinoff at some point, maybe they do something there. And again, it depends on the story. Like, I could see him coming back to do certain things for sure. Dead City and all of that. A lot of that seems unlikely, but it depends on the story. And that's why I think for Daryl Dixon, it kind of makes some sense in terms of the timeline. Like, you're having Rick come back to like the Commonwealth or wherever, Alexandria. But because of the timeline, like whenever they do reunite, like a lot of the other characters are going to have known that Rick made it back, right? Which is like kind of disappointing as a fan, because you want to see their first scenes together. So that's why I really want the Rick Grimes and Carol scene to actually happen. I really do. That's something that I think would be really incredible, because then you're at least seeing Carol's first reaction to seeing Rick for the first time in like many, many years, right? And then that kind of relates to how Carol's going to tell Daryl about, what happened to Rick. And so all that is explained. In terms of the Maggie and Negan stuff, yeah, you'll have to explain that a different way. But if you could just kind of do that, everything makes sense. Or you're going to have to explain it away as, I feel like Carol just never had time to go and see Rick and Michonne, but she heard that they're back. Like, is that how you're going to do it? Or, I mean, I hope that it's not Carol's just like, yeah, I saw them, but we're never going to see that scene, Like, I want to see like that scene. I really want to see all the reunions. That's what makes all of this so exciting and so special, right? Yeah, but to end this video, I do think that, yeah, Andrew Lincoln, appearing in like cameos and stuff like that and other shows and stuff, I do think is very likely. It's just that, again, it's really going to depend on the story, but I think it's even more likely now that we are going to see Andrew Lincoln, in cameo scenes as Rick Grimes. Whereas before, I think it was just kind of too hard to do that because of all the anticipation for Rick Grimes' return, right? And like the movie trilogy and like what it eventually became, right? There was so much hype for that. They weren't going to ruin his return with like a cameo scene, right? So that made sense. And obviously, for The Walking Dead, they ended it there. They had him there, but that just made sense because it was the end of The Walking Dead. And that really set up The Ones Who Live, right? Definitely post your thoughts down below. Do you think Andrew Lincoln could appear in The Walking Dead Daryl Dixon Season 2 or in Dead City? Hope you guys all enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.